I wonder if we could just hone in on Tony Blair.
So Tony Blair, I think, is one of the brightest and most damaging, dangerous human beings that has ever been near power in this country. As far as I can trace it back to Tony Blair, 2006.
This is straight out of Klaus Schwab's handbook.
DEI, by definition, is two-tier.
We're including that in two-tier. Is Islam compatible with democracy?
I can't point to a functioning democracy which is governed under Islamic principles. It's become a more aggressive religion.
Quite.
Yeah.
So
that's not democracy.
What to do about that problem? And how do we integrate?
My essential argument is twofold. The first is that...
Can I ask about reform? Because you ran with them.
So it's an interesting question. The beef I have with Nigel is...
Now, since we've recorded the interview, Ben Habib has officially announced his departure from Reform UK. Nevertheless, we go into some of those reasons that were bubbling underneath the surface in this conversation. Before you hear from Ben Habib, I ask, if you want to support this show, all you have to do is press like, comment, and subscribe. If you do that, I'm going to have more phenomenal guests like Ben Habib discussing the issues that you want to hear about and that the mainstream media won't touch. But without further ado, here he is, Ben Habib. Ben Habib, welcome to the Winston Marshall Show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Oh, good. Well, it's a delight for me, and I've been following you for some time. Much to discuss, particularly about the state of our country under Keir Starmer's government.
Yeah.
But the thing that I wanted to start with was your Oxford Union debate on Islam. Is Islam compatible with democracy? Now, I haven't actually seen the debate because it's not been published. So I'm keen to get your argument. Yeah. Is Islam compatible with democracy?
So when they first asked me about, inviting me to debate the subject, I was nervous because the surest way to get cancelled, is to go off beam with Islam. But it was, in my view, remains a very important debate to have. Is Islam compatible with democracy? And for me, the relevant democracy is the British democracy. So I did write back and say, I'll accept a debate as long as I can stick to the United Kingdom, because it's the British democracy about which I know the most. It's the one where it is, most relevant to me, whether or not Islam is compatible. And they said absolutely fine. So my argument, and one other preamble I'll make, is that, it's very easy when you're on our side of the debate to spend all your time pointing out flaws in things, because perhaps Trump will change things, but our side of the debate has not been in the ascendancy. We haven't been the received wisdom. We're kind of shouting at the houses, trying to get the houses to change. And I think it's very easy to get caught in the weeds in criticism and not offer up solutions. So I was very keen to go to that debate and point out what the problem is, to the extent that there's a problem, and offer up a solution. Mm-hmm. And so my essential argument, I don't know if it came across on the night or not, but my essential argument is twofold. The first is that the Quran, unlike the Bible, is the word of God, as delivered to the Prophet Muhammad through Gabriel. And if you have a book that is the word of God, it is by definition perfect. And if it's perfect, it is not open to scrutiny or challenges. And if it's not open to scrutiny or challenges, it is incapable of evolving. It is incapable of tolerating free speech. And without evolution and without being prepared to be challenged, it is inherently incompatible with Western democracy, with British democracy. There may be forms of democracy with which it is compatible. There's not much empirical evidence for it. If you look across the Middle East, to the extent that Turkey has a functioning democracy, it's at the expense of Islam, if you like, because Islam is required, or has been until recently in Turkey, been required to take a back seat. And in Pakistan, a country with which I'm quite familiar, the army is only ever 2 breaths away from exercising control. And Islam has, made it very difficult for Pakistan, I think, to have what we would look at and say is a functioning democracy. And then if you look at the rest of the Middle East, Egypt flirted with democracy and you got the Muslim Brotherhood, and very quickly the dictatorship came back in. Gaza flirted with democracy and we got Hamas. Lebanon flirted with democracy and we got, Hezbollah, which have got 15 seats out of the 123 in Lebanon, which is a small number of seats, but actually they exercise a disproportionate amount of influence on the country. Indeed, they control very large swathes of the country. And I can't point to a functioning democracy which is governed under Islamic principles. And of course, Iran, I come to last, which to arguably a democracy, but not one that looks and feels like a democracy that we would recognize a democracy, where women get, there was a woman, I think, killed the other day, we suspect killed because she wasn't wearing a hijab. And I think one woman actually stripped off naked because she was absolutely so frustrated by the whole thing and no one knows where she is. And that to me is not a democracy. And so the argument for Christianity, which is a very powerful one, is that Christianity both is prepared, its greatest strength has been its preparedness to take a backseat to state, and its preparedness to move with the times, evolve. That has also been Christianity's greatest weakness. The debate wasn't about the strengths and weaknesses of religion, but Islam's greatest weakness is its inability to debate about itself. That also is its greatest strength because it doesn't tolerate any debate. And in order to come to terms with Islam in the United Kingdom, we have more or less accepted the existence of the concept of Islamophobia. And that is something that's been propagated by people like Sadiq Khan and others in order, in my view, to give cover to Islam and to shut down debate about Islam. Because if you wish to challenge it, you're obviously irrationally in fear of the ideology of Islam. And then I think the two mistakes that we've made in the United Kingdom, which we have to fix, and it's critical we fix them. The first is the importation of large numbers of different ethnicities and cultures into the country at a rate with which we cannot cope. No matter what policies we adopt domestically, the rate of change is one a country cannot cope with. And but we've been absolutely absurd in coupling that rate of change with the regulatory and legislative framework that has created diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I'm sure you know better than I do, is the creation of a protected status around not just Muslims, but Hindus, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, minority sexual preferences, transgender ideology. They've all been swept up into, any minority basically has been swept up into a protected status, which stands against effectively the majority, which is the rest of us who stand outside this protected status, the protected status that's been afforded to these people. And that protected status is manifested itself in the progressive discrimination in favor of these, what they call progressive discrimination, which is nothing other than, in my view, regressive discrimination against the majority in this country. But if you are to put a protective blanket round all these ethnicities and minority cultures, and Islam, 4.9 million Muslims in this country are in
4.9?
4.9 million Muslims.
3.94 in the last census.
Well, I read 4. I could be wrong, but yeah,
it could well be.
By far the largest minority group within that protected status. That is the entity, that is the ethnicity, that is the culture within that protected status that is going to be prevalent, that's going to take, beyond the ascendancy. And because we, the majority, are more or less forbidden through, the creation of the term Islamophobia and DEI and the protected status that these people are given, because we're forbidden from challenging it, the prospect of integration is zero. Not just, by the way, with Muslims, but by anyone who's in that protected status group. And so what we've seen in the United Kingdom is a breakdown of society. Society requires a common culture. The definition of society, indeed the definition of a nation state, requires a common culture. And what we've got is the creation of multi-siloed, what they call multiculturalism, which I think has been so damaging to the United Kingdom. And the biggest component part of that is Islam. And Islam doesn't take challenges very easily. And we haven't integrated with these people, not just them, but lots of ethnic and other cultures, ethnicities and cultures that have come to this country. And we're therefore seeing the breakdown of British society. And it's not just that these different cultures are not compatible with British democracy or Western democracy. I think they pose a threat to Western civilization, because what we've got is antipathetic views and cultures being given protected status. And we, the majority, are having to take the knee to them. And ultimately, that it doesn't end well for the majority culture.
Yeah. So I want to come back to Britain specifically, our problems, Islamophobia, the new APPG law that Labour seem to be wanting to bring in, immigration, multiculturalism, lots there I want to discuss. But I just want to hone in on the specific argument from the Oxford Union. So Islam not being compatible with democracy. And before coming to those countries that you listed, it's worth just picking up on your opening point about the Quran. So through the Quran, it says you must take this literally. And it is a sin to not take this literally. It says all the way through. I think for someone who hasn't read the Quran, perhaps you could give a sort of explanation about this document, assuming that you have read it.
I haven't read the Quran. I've read extracts of the Quran, and I studied what they called Islamiyat because I was born in Pakistan. And so Islamiyat, which is religious studies, reading Islam, is something I studied as a child. So I have, I think, a good grasp of Islam, but I haven't actually read the Quran is a very difficult book to read. It's not written chronologically. It's written in order of size of chapters, basically, with the biggest chapters first, I think, and then you end up with the smallest chapters. So it's a terribly difficult book to come to terms with. You know, the chronology of the Bible is much easier because you start, in past tense. And
the hardest thing about the Quran, having read it, is how
you have read it.
Yeah.
Oh well, then you've got the advantage on me. Yeah.
It's difficult because it's rather tedious.
Yeah.
And very repetitive, and a lot of the stories are taken from Christian and Jewish the canon, and are misrepresented, so they're just wrong. So it's kind of a bit frustrating reading it.
But I wish when I debate Islam not to get stuck in the weeds on Islam. I don't want to go through. I try not to go through, Taqiyya, the abrogation of earlier verses by later verses, the hadith. I don't want to get into all of that, because I think when you get into that, you get stuck in the weeds of a debate which Muslim scholars will know a hell of a lot more about than I will. For me, I try to stand back and just look at the big picture, and the big picture is of an ideology which is perfect, and no ideology can be perfect if it's to be compatible with free speech, debate, and therefore democracy.
Right, okay. So then it'd be worth looking at the examples. So you bring up Turkey and Pakistan. Maybe I actually don't know. I know a bit about Turkey and Pakistan, but I actually don't know quite how those systems work. If Turkey is a democratic country, you say that they put Islam on a back?
Yeah, well, the Ataturk required effectively a secular state. He did not allow Islam to interfere in the structure of state.
But it's still Islamic, the country.
It is Islamic, but Islam has been required to take it back. So Islam, unfettered, perhaps I should be more explicit, unfettered Islam is not compatible with democracy. You do need mechanisms by which to hold it in check, which the Turks had basically achieved until quite recently. Erdogan is now doing what I think Pakistan has done ever since democracy really took off in Pakistan, which is for the demagogues to use Islam as a mechanism to gain votes. And it's been bad for Pakistan. There'll be Pakistani friends of mine watching this who'll probably be shaking their heads at the screen. But it's been, in my experience and my view, it's been bad for Pakistan.
Okay, but sorry to be sort of like pernickety, but if, let's say in Turkey, they have democracy and it's still a majority Muslim country. Doesn't that prove the point that democracy and Islam are compatible?
Well, I think it's the mechanism by which you have to keep Islam in the back room. You know,
but they've got a mechanism that works.
Yeah, but it's not necessarily the most democratic mechanism, not one that you and I would recognize, you know, because you're not allowed to come out and discuss. You know, my view of democracy, bedrock of democracy is freedom of speech. So you have to shut Islam down. And that's effectively what happened in Turkey. So if you have to shut something down in order for the democratic or the secular state to be able to function, then it should happen of its own volition. Are you with me? Christianity was never shut down. It has shut itself down, from what I can see, but it was never forcibly shut down. Pakistan is the other way. Islam and democracy have gone hand in hand in Pakistan. And, you know, just speaking again from personal experience, so in the post-immediate sort of independence of Pakistan period, the country it had a kind of democracy, but it was effectively run by generals all the way through till 1971. And then you had the election when Bhutto was, and people can debate whether he should have been made prime minister, because actually the Eastern Pakistani guy Mujibur Rahman got a bigger vote than Bhutto did, but they made Bhutto from West Pakistan to the prime minister, and then there was a war and East Pakistan became Bangladesh and so on. But in order to galvanize the masses in his support, contrary to popular belief, it wasn't General Zia-ul-Haq who made Pakistan an Islamic kind of, you know, really brought Islam to the fore. It was Bhutto. Bhutto started it by invoking Islam to get the votes of the mullahs and the support of the population behind him. And Zia took it to another level. I remember going to a referendum. It wasn't an election. It was a referendum on Islam in 1982. This is by memory, so the date may be slightly wrong. And I wasn't old enough to vote. And I went with my father, and I was 17. And the motion was, do you vote for Islam or not? That was the referendum motion. And if you vote for Islam, you have no option but to vote for General Zia-ul-Haq. Now, do you recognize that as a democratic form of government? I don't.
So, geopolitically speaking, the question I think that comes up a lot is not really whether Islam is compatible with democracy, or it's rather, can Islamism be controlled in a democratic country? So, for example, the countries that have done the best job of controlling the Islamists have been authoritarian Muslim-majority countries.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis.
Absolutely.
I know that Singapore is nominally democratic, but it's practically speaking, it's not quite that's the case. But they've done a great job of controlling Islamism. Can you just define Islamism for me? Islamism, I would put as extremist Islam,
not fundamentalist.
So, what difference would you make?
I think the issue with Islam, there was a much more open and less dogmatic form of Islam when I was a child. Curiously, actually, with time, I think it's become more fundamentalist. And the Wahhabi form of Islam, the pure Islam, and you can't challenge anything, has become more prevalent. So, for example, when I was a child in Pakistan, we used to say Khuda Hafiz, which means, God be with you. But now they say Allah Hafiz. And the reason they say Allah Hafiz is because God, Khuda Hafiz, Khuda could be any God. He could be a Christian God. He could be any form of God. So you have to say Allah to be precise. And that's an example of the way the country has moved with Islam. Islam has become, it's become a more aggressive religion, frankly, over the last 30, 40 years. It used to have a comfortable position in Pakistan, and maybe it was comfortable. Are you referring to
Pakistan specifically or globally?
Well, my best experiences are with my deepest experiences are of Pakistan. But you look across the globe, Wahhabi Islam is what's taking over. that kind of purist form of Islam, which I think starts in Wahhab or whatever his name was a guy from the 18th century, I think. And he wanted to get rid of the Muslim enlightenment, and he wanted to go back to the basic fundamentals of Islam. We're in deep danger here now of getting into a debate on Islam, into the weeds where I don't want to go. But, that's what I see being practiced. That's what...
Here in Britain?
No, yeah. In Britain, absolutely. It's fundamental. It's not extremist Islam. It's fundamentalist Islam. It's an Islam that's not prepared to bend, is not prepared to have a debate. There are lots of different strands in Islam. Some are prepared to have a debate, but Wahhabi Islam is not prepared to have that debate. And I think you'll find most educated Pakistanis who are Muslims have some issues with Wahhabi Islam.
I'm actually a little bit more optimistic.
Yeah, okay.
If I may. If we're talking about the global relations between Muslim countries and non-Muslim countries and Islam. And my optimism comes from the Abraham Accords, started by Jared Kushner and Trump, and under the Trump's first administration. And if you look at, let's say, Saudi Arabia, since 2005, I believe, when they had the Al-Qaeda attacks, they have done a great job of clamping down on that and they can because they're more of an authoritarian country. The Emiratis are, and particularly Mohammed bin Zayed,
they've been fantastic.
They've completely led the way. And for me, they show that not only there are Muslim majority countries that want to live prosperously beside the West,
with our liberal values.
They want to do so with Israel as well.
Yeah, so absolutely.
So for me, I see tremendous hope there. And they have done a good job of...
But they've done it by being aggressive.
Quite.
Yeah.
So
that's not democracy.
It's not democracy.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So this is, I want to come to the issue of Britain. Because here we are a liberal democracy.
Yeah.
And we have, I guess the facts about British Muslims are difficult ones. If I may, I'm going to read some out because I think it's
go for it. Yeah.
Read what I think is one of the biggest problems that our country might have, which is a separation of, let's say that how we're being divided, how British Muslims maybe are ending up at odds with other Brits. Not all. Now, I'm actually going to preface this, if I may, by saying that I can name some very honourable, brilliant British Muslims and noble. Some of whom have been on the show, like Ed Hussein. I think of Zia Youssef, the Reform Party, who you might know. It seems to me that there are plenty of good examples of honourable British Muslims who do believe in democracy and British values. But Henry Jackson Society, earlier this year, put out a poll. In it they found that 3/4 of British Muslims did not believe that Hamas had committed murder and rape on October 7th. Yeah. Almost half of British Muslims say Jews have too much power over UK government. British Muslims are more likely to have a positive than a negative view of Hamas. Nearly half of British Muslims would back the removal of an MP if they took a different stance with Israel-Palestine. 52% want to make it illegal to show a picture of the Muslim prophet Muhammad. 32% of British Muslims favour the implementation of Sharia law, and the same number the Declaration of Islam as a national religion. That's British Muslims. On top of that, we have 85 Sharia courts. We have something like 170,000 cases of FGM, I believe, in the UK.
Yeah.
This and it's unfortunate, but it's not just.
So I wouldn't say this is extremist Islam.
What would you say?
I would say it's fundamentalist Islam. Okay. That's why it's getting such broad traction. Extremism for me, I mean, we're perhaps debating semantics.
So extremism is like jihadis? Yeah,
jihadis who, want to go out and kill. But these are, and some of these people may wish to do that, but...
well, we know, according to MI5, we know that something like 40,000 are on a jihadi watch list.
Yeah, and if you look
that's 1 in 100.
If you do a Google search for the top 20 terrorist groups in the world, they've all got some association with Islam, just as it happens, which creates its own challenges.
Yeah. So wait, so fundamentalist Islam you're defining as this?
So so the challenge of Islam, I think, isn't the extremists. We tend to go down and just think, well, it's the extremists who are the problem. But I think it's the fundamental application of Islam. I think the only way Islam becomes compatible with our form of the form of democracy with which I grew up anyway, because I don't think we're quite as democratic as we used to be. The only way it becomes compatible is if it's prepared to have a debate about itself. And the fundamentalist isn't prepared to have a debate because it is the word of God.
Okay.
Are you with me?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I want to eventually end in a positive, which will be like, how do we unite these different Britons under one common banner, one common culture?
That's what we must always talk about, is how do we settle the situation?
Yeah. So I'd like to head there, but maybe we could explore the problem a little bit further.
Yeah,
so
sure.
you mentioned earlier Islamophobia.
Yeah.
And the term. The Labour Party intend to bring in the APPG definition, which, as far as I've understood it...
That was the 2019 APPG definition parliamentary group that put... Yeah, I mean, it's draconian. I can't remember all of it, but I've read it. And it shuts down debate, full stop.
So you can't even criticise Islam, is what I understand.
But by memory. You probably know more about the APPG. I haven't read it for a while. But...
Right, so that's dangerous and could well come in on top of all the other free speech.
It's very dangerous. It's blasphemy law. It's a regression. It's taking the country back, isn't it?
We haven't had that since the 17th century.
So in the pursuit of peace in our so-called society, we're prepared to shut down free speech. And, I mean, we're seeing it already. We saw it with Alison Pearson and a whole load of other examples. But this is another step in that direction. And it's the dumbing down of our democracy. Do you agree with me that an inherent component of democracy, one of its bedrocks, is the ability to debate freely, free speech? No free speech, no democracy. Do you agree?
Absolutely fundamental.
So, I mean, this is a big issue.
Yeah. And then I'll come back to free speech because I think it's a very interesting topic. But just to colour it in a little bit more, what the level of, I think, the problem. And you mentioned immigration.
Yeah.
So 2022, I think it was net 700,000 plus.
Yeah.
Similar number, 23, might be a bit less this year. We'll see.
Yeah. We should look at the gross numbers, in my view, but yeah.
Which is more like 1.2 million.
5 million over the last 5 years is what I make it. Gross figures.
I didn't even think about it like that. So we have a lot of people coming to the country and they don't share British values. They're not really being vetted. I guess maybe we start with the question is what to do about that problem and how do we integrate those people? I mean, perhaps I'm jumping ahead there, but or maybe what do you think why is this such a massive problem in simple terms?
Well, there's the economic argument, of course, and then there's the cultural argument, and I don't think they're separate. The economic argument plays into the cultural argument and vice versa. You know, they're integrated. If you have a country that hasn't got a settled culture, it's terribly hard for it to be prosperous. You know, we're seeing a breakdown in society. We're seeing protests, riots, and all that kind of thing. And it's critical that we have a settled culture. And that culture needn't be the precise culture that we had in the 19th century. All cultures evolve. But there's a rate at which, cultures can cope with evolution. And it's quite slow. You know, you can't have dramatic shifts because it's, you've got to wait. I mean, you'll know this, I'm sure, better than I will. But, for new scientific theories, for example, to be established, they're not done through argument and debate. You've got to wait for a whole group of people to die. And it's the same with cultures. You need, new cultures get established when people have passed on from the old beliefs and the old views. And we've had more, as Suella Braverman puts it, more immigration into this country in the last 25 years than in all of history before that. And we've coupled that. Rein me in if I'm going ahead of the discussion, but we've coupled that massive immigration with the protected status we give these people who come to this country. So we've made literally no attempt for integration. In fact, we eschew integration. Integration isn't required. We've taken the view as a country, or those that govern us have taken the view, that actually lots of different cultures, all coexisting, is the form that's going to enrich the country. And I would say it's deeply damaging, particularly, just going back to the economic argument, if you've got progressive discrimination in place, because we've seen, I mean, I have to do this in my job as CEO of a public listed company, FCA registered, subject to all of this. I need to report on the ethnicities that I have on the board, the senior executives. I need to tell my bank what I'm doing in order to promote DEI.
Is this a new law?
No, this goes. So this is all borne out. So, like with so many things that are wrong in society, this starts, as far as I can trace it back, to Tony Blair, 2006, and the Companies Act. He put in something called Section 172 of the Companies Act, and until 2006, basically, as a company director, you had 4 obligations to your shareholders, to your, well, in this order, to the taxman, to your creditors, to your employees, and to your shareholders. Those were the 4, and they were all basically money creating obligations. You know, you create money, so you pay a tax. You create money, so you pay your creditors. You create money, so you can pay your employees. And whatever's left over, your shareholders get. Then in 2006, he introduced Section 172 into the Companies Act, which created stakeholder economy, where you have to look after the interests not just of those 4, but the environment in which you operate, the people, the cultural setup in which you're operating. And it's just a small change in the Companies Act, and it's snowballed and snowballed and snowballed to the point where in 2018 the Financial Reporting Council, which is the regulatory body for things like accountants, actuaries, and so on. Bear with me, it sounds a bit
No, I'm
dull.
interested in this because this is straight out of Klaus Schwab's handbook, Stakeholder Capitalism. He's literally got a book called Stakeholder Capitalism.
Yeah. So what the FRC...
This is the globalist...
This is the way they propagate it. It's a bit like a sexually transmitted disease, you know, and I say that because people listening to this will understand, you know...
Less fun.
Well, much less fun. Yeah. No pleasure in this one. But the FRC, the Financial Reporting Council, require all its members and all those entities that it regulates, including accountants, to practice DEI and ESG. So it's ESG, you know, environmental, social, governance. S is the DEI component. And it requires that not only should its members practice ESG, all the entities with which those members do business must be in turn required to practice ESG if they are to continue to do business with them. Now, if you turn that on accountants and you turn it on financial institutions, you've got into the fabric, the entire fabric of the economy. So the entire economy is now no longer working on meritocracy and the pursuit of money and making money, which is what an economy should turn on. Mm-hmm. It's turning on weird things like making sure that you've got, you know, a number of minority interests on your board. And thankfully, as a half Pakistani brown looking guy, I can tick that. Otherwise, I'd be part of the middle-aged white heterosexual male problem, which is what this regulation creates. And that's what I mean about progressive discrimination, a protected status around these people. So culturally, that's very damaging. Economically, it's very damaging because a company should only hire on merit. We had the RAF. I'm sure you saw this the other day.
I didn't.
So the RAF had a policy only to recruit fighter pilots from ethnic minorities. Now, what kind of fighter pilots do you want in the sky? I want the best damn fighter pilots we've got. I don't want to know that they're from a ethnic Pakistani background or Indian background. I couldn't care what color they are. Yeah. I want the best bloody fighter pilots in our jets.
Yeah.
And you're dumbing down the United Kingdom in the pursuit of this, what I call a false ideology. So critical, I don't know where, I've probably spoken for too long and I should give you a
please,
go. But, you know, critical to resolving the problem is not only cutting back the rate at which people are coming in, but to remove this protected status, to make sure that people, and you know, people talk about two-tier policing. Two-tier policing, and they should say two-tier criminal justice system, by the way, not just two-tier policing, is just another example of the two-tier society in which we live. It's everywhere. It is literally everywhere.
Yeah. And it's being denied. I want to ask about then two-tier policing. Maybe you should, for someone who doesn't believe two-tier policing or two-tier justice exists.
You don't believe it exists?
Well,
No, of someone who doesn't. Someone
who
watching.
doesn't,
Yeah.
right?
Okay. Yeah.
Now, Keir Starmer doesn't believe.
Yeah.
Priti Patel doesn't believe it exists.
Doesn't she?
No, she says two-tier policing does not exist.
Okay. I'm surprised by
So-
Priti.
Quite a few people deny its existence. I'm old enough to remember when The Guardian would hammer us every month saying two-tier policing existed, but it was a different
It was
time.
the other way. Yeah.
So you say it's everywhere. What?
Yeah.
Spill it. Play. Can you paint the scene? Like, how broad is this two-tier?
Yeah. So it is
problem?
endemic in our economy through the mechanisms that I described. Every public company has to practice progressive discrimination. Every public company, every education.
You're including that in two-tier.
It's a two-tier society.
I guess I hadn't put that in. But
It's a two-tier society.
Yeah.
If you're white,
DEI is two-tier.
it's two-tier.
Hmm.
DEI by definition is two-tier. And so we have a two-tier society. We shouldn't stop at two-tier policing. But police officers, just like everyone else, are trained into believing that you've got to put a kind of protective blanket around ethnic minorities. The I've got to get the name right, the Crime Sentencing Commission, I think they're called, either Criminal Sentencing Commission or Crime Sentencing Commission, which is the body that advises on the level of the kind of sentence that courts should be handing out for various crimes, came out a few months ago and said that people's backgrounds should be taken into account when a court sentences. Now, Lady Justice has a blindfold round her above the Old Bailey because the whole point about justice is that it should be blind. It doesn't matter who you are, where you came from, what your special circumstances are, whether you're rich or poor, black, white, Pakistani, whatever, justice should apply to you equally. The minute you make the leap to trying to contextualize the individual's crime because of their background, you've undermined the criminal justice system. So when people say to me we don't have two-tier policing or two-tier justice system, I mean they're not thinking straight.
I wonder if we could just hone in on Tony Blair. So it's interesting to me that you pin it there. I've never actually heard it gone so far back when it comes to DEI or, let's say, Schwabist Davos style globalism. Or that sort of type of philosophy. But certainly I've heard that the beginning of the immigration crisis, and I believe this, started with Tony Blair. What do you think was in the water then? What happened under New Labour that kicked this all off?
So Tony Blair, I think, is one of the brightest and most damaging, dangerous human beings that has ever been near power in this country. And I say I think we all know why he's damaging. But the reason I say he's bright is he either fluked this or he was able to see how he could get his ideology so embedded in our structures that it would become a devil's job to revoke what he's done. And he effectively, in my view, circumvented the constitutional principle. I know we don't have a written constitution, but we have a constitutional principle that no parliament can bind a successor parliament, that every parliament must have the right, when it comes into office, when you get a new parliament after a general election, it must have the right to do whatever it wishes to do, unfettered by any past law. And so what he did was remove powers from parliament. And he did it in a number of ways. The first was to create all these quangos with which we now have to live. His first example of doing it was giving the Bank of England independence. And he said, we've got to give the Bank of England independence because we've had boom bust and politicians are not good with money. So we need an independent set of experts running monetary policy. So we're going to take it away from the meddling politicians and give it to the experts. And to the untrained, unknowing eye in 1998 when he did it, you think, well, that kind of makes sense, right? But he also did it with the Human Rights Act, where he embedded in the Human Rights Act of 1998 the European Convention of Human Rights, gave the European Court of Human Rights supremacy over all British courts. So we now have an unelected court abroad. And he did it through signing international treaties, signing us up into international institutions. Obviously, he was a great Europhile. And, we abrogated a great deal of our ability to govern ourselves to the European Union. And through these mechanisms, the creation of independent bodies like Ofcom, for example, He took power away from politicians. He took scrutiny away from the people. He made it impossible for the people through their elected representatives to change the way the country is governed. And he embedded his own form of stakeholder capitalism, governance, etc. And so now, as I'm sure you would have heard it said many times, and you'll be more aware of it than I am, whenever we wish to do anything domestically, people say, well, you can't do that because you breach international law, or we'd become a pariah state. We'd be the only European country not to be a member of the European Convention of Human Rights. Do you want to be alongside Belarus and Russia? These kind of arguments. But it was inherent in the British system that no parliament could bind a successor parliament. And that's what Tony Blair succeeded in doing. And the Conservatives, sadly, even though David Cameron, when he came to office, said he was going to revoke a lot of that, he didn't do it. He said he was going to abolish Ofcom. He didn't do it. And he gave it more powers. I think he put the post office is now governed by Ofcom. He gave it more power. And George Osborne created the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is the entity that opines on Chancellor's budgets. And Labour, I don't know if you're aware of this, Winston, but it was in the King's Speech, which is their intended legislative agenda, is going to give make it a legal requirement for chancellors to get the OBR to sign off their budgets. Now, that's basically saying to government...
This is Starmer. This is now.
This is Starmer. So monetary policy has gone to the Bank of England, and soon fiscal policy won't be allowed to be made without the OBR signing off on it. So in government, what does government have? One of its biggest levers is fiscal policy. It used to be monetary policy, fiscal policy, regulations and laws, right? You neuter the ability to make regulations and laws by binding ourselves into international institutions and legal treaties and so on. You neuter the ability to influence monetary policy by handing it over to Andrew Bailey, who so adeptly cut Liz Truss off at her knees when she wanted to do something he didn't quite like. And now you give away fiscal policy to the OBR. Yeah. The Parliament, what's the point of the government?
Yeah. What's the point of democracy?
What's the point of democracy? What is the point of democracy?
Yeah. It's a bureaucratic hellscape that you describe. A quick interruption to your show. If you would like exclusive content, exclusive interviews, and exclusive videos, come over to the Winston Marshall Substack. It's at winstonmarshall.co.uk, and there you can interact with me directly. It's winstonmarshall.co.uk, and you'll find links in the comments below. But back to the interview. How do we understand Keir Starmer in this? Is it Blair plus socialism? Is it just a continuation of Blairism? How do you make of our Prime Minister?
So Starmer, I think, is an unreconstructed communist. I think he stands against the state. First of all, he's anti-British. And that a lot of people will look at this and hear this and say, oh, God, swivel-eyed, alarmist nonsense. No, he's anti-British.
Give an example of why he's anti-British.
He's anti-British because he's inherently a Europhile. And it was one thing to vote Remain when we were part of the European Union, but we are now out. To be a Europhile now is basically to say to the British people, and he is a Europhile, whether or not he admits it, is to say to the British people, I want to give governance of this country away to a third power, and I want to take our borders down so that we can have freedom of movement with that third power, and I'm going to give up our currency to their currency. I'm going to give up complete control of our monetary policy.
But he's not saying that.
But he's a Europhile. He's not saying it. But I know that's where he is. He has said when he thought he was off camera in Montreal in September 2023. Are you aware of this?
Tell me. This is the Davos thing.
No, not that was Emily Maitlis. That was another great one. No, off camera he said, if I am to become Prime Minister, I will align us so closely to the European Union that we might as well be a member. That was in September 2023. You cannot wish to do that to your own country. There cannot be a legitimate case made, that is pro-British, which gives over governance to a third party. There will always be things that we need to do as a country that's different to the European Union or different to Germany, France, and whatever. And we must retain the ability to do it. And if you're prepared to give that up, you are inherently anti-British. That's how I see it. And so Starmer, I think, is anti-British. He's anti-free enterprise. We saw that in the budget because the employers' national insurance increases that she brought in, brought in, does not affect the public sector. She carved out the public. It's only for the private sector.
They have no idea. They're all bureaucrats. They have no idea. The example as you're speaking was, I'm reminded of his quote with Mateless about Davos, which is that he prefers being in Davos than Westminster.
I know.
Which,
it's extraordinary.
Westminster, the palace of democracy.
Absolutely.
The voice of the people. And no, he'd rather be in Davos with the unelected, rub shoulders with the lobbyists and the bureaucrat, all the corporate power. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist.
I think to be a conspiracy theorist requires you to be quite an optimist, actually, because it presumes that people can think things through and get together and make plans. And, life is much messier than that. But with the World Economic Forum, effectively what you've got is the richest people in the world coming together with the most powerful people in the world, meeting behind closed doors, having discussions of which there are no minutes. That no good ever came from big money being in bed with big power. It is a very dangerous thing.
It's more dangerous because what information we do have, and I took the time to read Klaus Schwab's books, and it's terrifying. This particular thing that really stood out, and I think this is relevant to what you said about Tony Blair and stakeholder capitalism, but certainly to Davos and being anti the people, as Keir Starmer is. There's a whole chapter, I think it's in The Great Reset or it's in one of the books about how we need to set up new morals and values, as if we don't have religion to do that.
Yeah.
We need new morals and values. And the only thing that all of humanity have in common that we can grant, that can be the mooring, that can be the God to build a new moral structure above, is the climate crisis. And he says throughout all the literature, Klaus Schwab, it's climate crisis, almost every other sentence. So it's a terrifying world who want to not just have control.
It's Orwellian, isn't
they
it?
They want to create new morals for us.
Yeah.
As if we the people
And they're doing it
ourselves.
it is absolutely straight out of 1984. You need an external enemy. In this case, it's climate change. And it's man-made climate change. You're the problem. You, humanity, you're the problem. Yeah. Therefore, this is the solution. And you, as you rightly say, we have to adopt a whole new way of living and a whole new set of values.
Yeah. So, okay, is there not hope? If you look around the world, because there's not much hope in Britain, but is there not hope when you look at what happened in America this month with Trump being elected? When you look at what's happening in Argentina,
doesn't he speak a lot of sense?
Yeah, and Milei saying, we don't compromise with the libtards, and he quite literally uses that language. And Bukele in El Salvador, is God's work getting rid of the criminal cartels. In Europe, maybe you'd say Meloni or Orban. Do you see hope in all of that?
Bizarrely, if you'd asked me this question a few months ago, I would have said I'm getting close to without hope. But I'm very hopeful, actually. There was a real moment of hope in 2016 when we voted for Brexit. The vote for Brexit, in my mind, was not just a vote to leave the European Union, which was obviously critically important, I think, for the United Kingdom. But it was a vote for our politicians and our elected representatives to represent the people's interest. It was a vote to re-energize and re-establish the nation state that is the United Kingdom. And with the United Kingdom comes not just the economic unit or the democratic constitutional unit, also comes a self-belief in who we are, our history, our standing in the world, etc., etc. So the vote for Brexit was a cry from the British people, which our politicians basically stood against. All of them, with a few exceptions, which is why we didn't get Brexit. And we still don't have Brexit. We still don't have Brexit, whatever they say. We haven't.
Because of our part still being in the ECHR?
No, not the ECHR. So the ECHR technically isn't part of the European Union.
Sure, but in effect, the idea of sovereignty is...
Yeah, no, but the two deals that Boris Johnson signed, the withdrawal agreement and the trade and cooperation agreement, basically hitch us to the hip. the Remainers will say, "Oh God, it was a hard Brexit." Wasn't a hard Brexit. We've left Northern Ireland behind. First of all, we've put a regulatory border down the Irish Sea. We have hitched ourselves at the hip in matters of state aid, competition, employment, and crucially environmental law to the European Union. So if we want to ditch net zero, we would be breaching the non-regression obligations we've taken on in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which state that we are not able to change any domestic legislation which was in place on the 31st of December 2020, even if that domestic legislation has future effect. Now, net zero is the future effect of the domestic legislation that Theresa May put on the books in July 2019. Do you remember her parting shot was making our country committed to net zero? So because of the agreement Boris Johnson signed, and this is how they use international law to fetter themselves, we can't get off net zero. And just to complete the thing, we're also bound into contributing to Horizon Europe, which includes amongst it
what in Europe?
Horizon Europe. So Horizon Europe is a research body set up by the European Union, mostly for climate change. And it is to promote the political aims of the European Union through research and principally through climate change. But it also includes something called the European Defence Fund, which is a military research facility for the creation of European weaponry with the view of the European Defence Union on an interoperable basis. So it's the coming together of all the armed forces of the European states under Brussels. And so we're contributing to the European Defence Fund. And Starmer, if you listen to what he's saying, one of the reasons I think, sorry, I'm slightly digressing.
No, I'm
but
interested, yeah.
So one of the reasons Starmer has put military spending on hold while he has a review is, I think, because he wants to get closer to what they're doing in Europe, because he wants military interoperability. He wants the United Kingdom to be part of the European Defence Union. Now, the European Defence Union is not like NATO. NATO is members of NATO coming together and deciding that they're going to cooperate for the protection of Europe and the North Atlantic Treaty. The European Defence Union and the permanent structured cooperation that comes through it is a combined European military under the direction of Brussels. It's not like NATO. And so...
How big is it?
Well, thankfully, at the moment, it's pretty useless because it just it includes a whole load of European countries that don't have a very good military. We have a hollowed out military compared to where we were. But if you look at Germany, which is the next biggest military spender in Europe, it doesn't come anywhere near the United Kingdom. But I tell you what's really interesting is in the last few days, I think it was 2 days ago, the European Union has declared that some of the cohesion funds that it's got, which is its biggest budget, cohesion funds are the structural funds that the EU has for the levelling up of Europe, money that should go into Poland and Central and Eastern Europe for bringing their standards up to Western European standards. That cohesion funding, 390 billion of it, is now going to be accelerated towards defence spending because they fear what Trump is going to do with NATO, and they fear, Russia being aggressive, and they fear what might happen in Ukraine. So contrary to the...
But they could just spend that on fulfilling their obligations to NATO spending. I guess it's European money rather than each.
It's European money, but it's European money being spent on European defence under the direction of Brussels. So that's where they're going. And 390 billion, that's a lot of bloody money. We spend about 55 billion a year on our armed forces. That's 390 billion they're committing over the next few years. That's a lot of money. And it's a step by the European Union that they said they would never take. Do you remember Nick Clegg in 2014 when he was debating with Nigel Farage said there'll never be a European army. It's all scaremongering. That's precisely what they're going to with the European Defence Union. So Just coming, so we're part of the EDF in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement also obliges us to remain committed to the European Convention of Human Rights, even though the ECHR is not part of the EU, and the EU is not a member of the ECHR. But we've given a commitment to the EU that we will stay in the ECHR. We've also done other things. This is perhaps too laborious, Winston, so...
Please. This is important. People need to know this.
Yeah, so the other thing that we've signed up to is the European arrest warrant in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So that means basically if a Romanian court passes a judgment that some British citizen needs to be arrested, there's very little defence the British court can afford the British citizen. We've got to hand that individual. There are some arguments that can be made, but we have to basically hand a British citizen over to a foreign court.
Has that happened?
No, I don't think it has happened. But that's what's in that agreement, in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And people don't appreciate how... So that's the form of Brexit. That's not Brexit.
Yeah.
You know, we can't change our environmental law. We can't change our state aid laws. We can't change employment law, competition law. We're signed up to the European arrest warrant. We're committed to funding the European Defence Union through the European Defence Fund and development of interoperable weaponry for the Europe. That's not Brexit.
Yeah. So, you've painted a picture of how unbelievably tangled we are. But you did start by saying... You're actually hopeful.
Yeah.
So where on earth? Because at the moment, I came into this conversation hopeful, and I'm going out very bleak.
So it's an accident of our parliamentary electoral process that we've got a stomping, massive Labour majority. And I was hopeful from the last election, because what happened at the last election was actually the Labour vote went down. In 2019, they got 10.3 million votes. In the last election, they got 9.7 million votes. The reason they've got the stonking majority is because a very significant number of people didn't vote. They're often labelled as apathetic voters. I don't think they're apathetic. They're despondent. They voted for Brexit. They didn't get it. They voted in 2016. They voted for Theresa May in 2017. She didn't do what she promised. They voted for Boris Johnson. He didn't do what he promised. And so they're just sitting on their hands going, I've had enough. We need to get to those voters. We need them back out. We had 4 million votes for reform who do stand for a dramatic change in the way the country would be governed. Whether or not
you stood.
And I stood, and, I was deputy leader of reform. And whether or not reform is up to the challenge remains to be determined. But there are people out there who get it. And we got 4 million votes when the narrative being put out by our opposition is a vote for reform is a wasted vote, a vote for reform is splitting the right-wing vote, it's damaging the Conservatives, blah, blah, blah. And you will never get an MP. People now see that we can get an MP. So I think there's going to be quite a seismic difference in people's view of reform and the ability to get rid of the uniparty of Conservatives and Labour. And the other reason I hold out hope, and we discussed it before the programme started, and this is what really gives me real cause for hope, is Trump's clean sweep in the United States of America and his apparent coming into office having thought everything through from what I can see. He knows precisely what he's going to do this term. And he's got the Senate. He's got the House of Representatives. This is his last term as president. He's got
the Supreme Court. He didn't win it this time. He already had it.
Yeah. So he's got every institution that's required to be on his side in order to give effect to the change that he wishes to deliver on his side. And
he's coming out swinging it as well. All these videos he's been putting in.
Which is superb.
Coming after the gender stuff, the deep state. He just announced that he's launching with Doge with Elon Musk and Ramaswamy. Every day, it's just another
it's phenomenal.
Whopper of a video.
So there are two impacts, I think, for us.
What difference does that make to us in Britain?
So the first impact is this. From a purely economic perspective, if we don't deregulate and cut taxes the way he is going to deregulate and cut taxes, we will see an exodus of capital out of the United Kingdom to the United States of America. It doesn't matter whether you get a trade deal. A trade deal is irrelevant. Everyone talks about a trade deal with the US. Forget it. If we have an exodus of capital, there won't be any point having a trade deal because we'll have nothing to sell the United States of America. You know, you need to have a product which they wish to buy. The only way that we can get products they wish to buy is by following suit with their deregulatory tax-cutting measures so that our industry can keep up with their industry.
But there's no chance that's going to happen under Starmer.
Well, then we're going to have real problems, and it may need to get worse before it gets better. But he will be revealed as the emperor with no clothes if he doesn't recognise the massive economic damage that will befall the UK if it doesn't follow the American economic direction of travel. It was fine with Biden because Biden was on the climate crisis nonsense. Biden was fine with open borders. Biden was fine with all the, you know, highly regulated and highly taxed and so on. Trump is going to get rid of all of that, and it'll reveal us in Europe. Mm-hmm. So that's the first cause for hope.
I don't see any hope in Starmer doing that because, you know, he's a bloody socialist.
No, but the Conservatives might. You know, the Conservatives and the...
So what the Conservatives might? They have no power.
No, but they will. They will eventually. Well, there will be a right wing. I hate the expression right wing because I think
you mean
actually
the Conservative lowercase c.
Yeah, lower c.
Right of British politics.
Yeah.
In 2029, great. In 5 years.
Well, it may come sooner. If Starmer doesn't get on the bandwagon, if Rachel Reeves continues to do what she's doing, we may be off to the IMF cap in hand. If you go to the IMF cap in hand, I think you've got to call a general election. I can't see any other way out of it. And this government has fallen in popularity faster than any other government I've known in my adult time, my political cognizant existence. And so it could come sooner than later. But the other reason I think that it's so important is not just the economic impact with which we need to, you know, come to terms if we're not going to follow suit, but it's legitimized views of the kind that you and I hold. All of a sudden, the biggest country in the world, the most powerful country in the world, economically and militarily and so on, is going to ditch all this nonsense.
Yeah.
You know, it gives all of us cover.
Not just them, China are doing it as well. It's quite funny, this picture of Keir Starmer at COP with the only other people who turned up was the Taliban.
Yeah, it's hilarious.
All the major nations give just net zero. All of this stuff it's going to be old. You're going to look completely old hat trying to push this stuff.
Wasn't it hilarious, Aliyev, if that's how you pronounce it, singing the virtues of fossil fuels at COP29.
He was the Azerbaijani
president or whatever. Right, yeah. It's just hilarious. You couldn't make it up. But so it gives us cover and it legitimizes our position so we can make our case more forcefully. And I hope that will be a reformation in the way that we practice our politics. And it may take a while. You know, it may take a while. Things may get worse. But, you know, we've got to get there in the end.
Can I ask about reform? Because you ran with them. In researching for this interview, found it hard to understand whether or not you're part of reform because, on the one hand, you wrote a Times article where the headline was "Farage sacked me," but in the article it didn't say that.
No, I mean I didn't write the headline. You know, the headline's always written by the newspaper.
What's your relationship with reform?
Yeah,
and you said in your talking there, you said we speaking for reform. So, you still part of reform?
So it's an interesting question. If you listen to Nigel says Ben's not even a member of Reform. Well, if I'm not a member of Reform now, it means I was never a member of Reform because I haven't resigned as a member of Reform. But perhaps the more pertinent point is that there are no genuine members of Reform. And this is one of the bugbears I've got with the party, is that it's not democratized. There are no members. You are a subscriber. The party is actually controlled by Nigel. It's a private limited company with shares, and there are 15 shares. Nigel owns 9 of them. And when Richard was talking to me about me joining back in late 2022, early 2023, I said I would only join if Nigel gave up his control of the party. Nigel refused. We had a debate, and in the end I settled for a letter from Richard, who was then leader. Nigel wasn't leader back then. I settled for a letter from Richard promising that the party would be run on a consensual basis, that we wouldn't do deals with the Tories because I didn't like the way we stood down in 2019, that we would continue the fight for Brexit because I didn't believe Brexit was done. I have a slight ideological difference with Nigel on Brexit.
Which is?
Which is that he says Brexit's done. He says Brexit's done. It's just that we haven't taken advantage of Brexit. And I say to Nigel, no, I disagree. I fundamentally disagree. We voted for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. We didn't vote for two new treaties, one of which leaves Northern Ireland behind in the European Union. And you may not care. One may not care. Being an Englishman, one may not care for Northern Ireland. That is a fundamentally wrong position to take because they are part of the United Kingdom. If we're not prepared to stand by our kin in Northern Ireland, we are nothing.
Do you think there should be a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic?
There's no need for a hard border anywhere. We have, first of all, the trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic is only 5 billion a year versus 25 billion between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. The trade is de minimis. All that's required is a light touch mutual enforcement agreement where we say anyone in the United Kingdom wishing to export to the Republic of Ireland must make sure that their products comply with the Republic of Ireland. And if they don't, we, the British courts in this country, will fine you. And, EU, you have to accept that. And similarly, any business in the Republic which wishes to sell goods into Northern Ireland must comply. And if they don't comply, we'll leave it to the EU and the Republic of Ireland to enforce that requirement.
Right.
And you can have an open border. It was such a dumbing down of trade debate when Varadkar went to the European Union. He was the Taoiseach or whatever they call it, the Prime Minister of the Republic. In September 2018, he took a photograph of a bombed out border post from 1972. And he said, this is what's going to happen if we put the trade border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And he literally weaponized the whole debate. Theresa May, who wanted to craft a mechanism by which the entire United Kingdom stayed in the single market, gave in to that notion, and she allowed the notion to take root. Mm-hmm. And it's a false notion. There's no need for a hard border anywhere.
So back to reform.
Yeah.
So I can see that there's differences, obviously. Yeah. But so does that mean you
No. So
where does that leave us?
So for me, a prerequisite for reform, in my view, for reform to succeed, whether reform likes to accept it or not, a prerequisite for them to succeed is a proper democratization of the party. You cannot have a political party that stands for democracy which isn't democratic itself. And can you imagine the absurd headlines in May 2029 if reform were to form the next government? It would say Nigel Farage owns the government. It's a nonsensical position.
Because there's no election protocol within...
Well, I mean, he's got 9 out of the 15 shares. He owns 60% of the party. Mm-hmm. Literally owns 60% of the party. Now, they have said they will democratize. Zayar Yousaf said on the 22nd of August this year, I think responding to the pressure that I'd been putting on, he said that he had the finest legal minds working on a constitution day and night. And actually the document they then produced was a document I'd rejected 18 months earlier, which doesn't do the job. And that raises a few question marks in my mind about the direction that reform is going in. I don't think it's a good look for the chairman of the party to say something which is demonstrably not true. We've had that kind of nonsense from the Tories and Labour Party for the last 27 years. We need to chart a different direction. So there are differences between me and reform. But the movement that we've created, the reform movement, is a movement of which I am a part. And I will not leave the reform movement. And we, the people who gave hope and aspiration to that movement, created that movement, we have a great debt to that movement. The reason fewer people voted this time versus 2019 is because people are despondent. And it's the hollowing out of our democracy if we don't vote, if people don't vote. So what I say to Nigel, Richard, and the other members of the leadership team is be very careful how you deal with the popular support you have. It should be nurtured. It should be held very sensitively in kids' gloves, and make sure you deliver for the people. Do not let them down. Don't leave the battlefield. Don't put your personal interests first. Don't hoodwink the people. Stay true to our ideology. And fundamentally, our ideology is a strong, proud, prosperous, sovereign, united kingdom in all its guises.
Do you think that the Tories are redeemable at this point? And Kemi Badenoch, their new leader, what do you think? What do you make of her shadow cabinet? Is there any hope there?
So Kemi was very clever during the leadership contest, which she won for the Conservative Party, because she managed to convey being of our persuasion without actually pinning her colours to any particular policy. In fact, she said she wasn't going to discuss policy. She wanted first as a party to establish principles, then she would establish how they're going to deliver those principles, and then they'd start writing policies and getting ready for the government, for the next government. I think that's basically her approach. And when you look at the complexion of the shadow cabinet she's put together, there's a lot of people in it who I wouldn't want anywhere, what I would call liberal Democrats. But if she
Wet Tories.
If she didn't do that, she wouldn't last 5 seconds as a leader. So I'm not going to judge Kemi right now. I'm going to wait and see what Kemi does, not these initial few stages that she's taken. And I'm very hopeful, this comes back to your point about hope, that she will be looking at Trump and feeling bolder.
Yeah.
And she'll be saying, well, we better get on that. Yeah. And I hope she's looking at reform. I hope she's looking at reform and thinking, we better out-reform because we won't get the votes. The threat to the Conservative Party is not from the Liberal Democrats. The threat to them not forming the next government is reform, taking votes off them, and the despondent 4 or 5 million people who voted in 2019 and didn't vote in 2024.
Yeah.
She needs to get them out.
Yeah.
Or someone needs to get them out. We need to get them out. And if reform gets them out, it'll be toast for the Conservative Party, and you may see a reform-led government or coalition.
Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely possible. We came second in 98 seats. We fought that election on $1 million or 2 million quid.
Wow.
And we came second in 98 seats. We got 5 MPs. People were telling me all the way up to the beginning of the election, you're just wasting your time. You're just a spoiler. You're not going to get any MPs. Now they say you've only got 5 MPs. 5 MPs, you start building.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that there's any chance of a coalition?
This side of an election, unlikely. But if reform stand and they get, 100 seats and the Tories get 200 and what is it that they need 215 or 220 or whatever, then why not?
I guess the why not for me would be that in 2019 you mentioned the deal. It would have been then the Brexit Party. Was the deal done between Brexit Party and the Tories about giving up running in
317 seats,
quite a lot of seats, and the Tories then upsetting Farage and the Brexit Party in the deal? Have the bridges been burnt, do you think?
No, I mean, politics is the bridges are never burnt, are they? But the tragedy of 2019 was there are very few elections that are one-issue elections. And the 2019 election was one issue. It was get Brexit done. Do you remember? That was the election.
Yeah.
It was all about Brexit. And which party owned Brexit in 2019? It wasn't Boris. It was us, the Brexit Party. We owned it. And if we hadn't stood down, I think we would have got MPs back in 2019. The argument made by Nigel back then was, and it was Nigel's decision to stand down. There was no discussion with the MEPs in European Parliament. It was Nigel decided it, was that if we don't stand down against Boris, and it was against all Tory MPs that we stood down, we won't get a Boris Johnson government. We may get a Jeremy Corbyn SNP coalition. There'll be a second referendum, and we will defeat Brexit altogether. So the correct thing to do is stand down. The beef I have with Nigel is not that so much that he stood down, but that he stood down against people like Theresa May, and I wouldn't have done that. I would have stood down against Caroline Flint. Do you remember her? She was a Labour. We stood against Caroline, and Caroline lost the seat, but she was a good Brexiteer. And the debate, we talked about right and left. The schism in politics is not between right and left. The schism in politics is between those of us who believe in our country and those of us who don't.
Yeah.
And actually, everything else is of subsidiary importance until that is resolved.
Yeah. That's a great observation, by the way, because I also think that if you look at all the international populist movements, they're all actually different. And there are issues with all, different priorities with all of them. Let's say Bukele with crime, or Malay with the bureaucracy. But actually, what unites probably all of them is the sovereigntist movement. It's the idea of sovereignty, I think.
Nation state.
Nation state. It's a nation state revolt against the globalists.
Yeah, that's what's going on. That's precisely what's going on.
Yeah.
Which is why, people, do you remember a lady called Natalie Elphicke? You may or may not remember her. Anyway, she was a Tory MP, and she was regarded as a right-wing Tory MP. And just before the election, she crossed the floor from the Conservatives to the Labour Party. Now, when you think, well, she's a right-wing Tory and she's crossed to the Labour Party, I can't make any sense of that. That doesn't make any sense because the question's not being framed the right way.
Yeah.
She was a globalist.
Yeah. This is Rory Stewart's the same. It's like, how is it that Rory Stewart went from Tory to saying at this last election in July 24
Vote Labour.
That not only Labour, he's considering voting for the Green Party. He went literal communists.
Yeah.
So how that makes no sense. Yeah. But it does make sense when you
put the question right, globalist or nationist.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm a great believer in this country, and so I'm a nationist through and through, and I just hope that that's the agenda that wins out.
Yeah. Well, we've discussed so much in this conversation, and we've sort of painted I feel a bit more bleak about the future.
No, but I think for the first time we can have hope. I really do believe that. I think Trump is a massive, massive thing for us. And the British people are fantastic, don't you think, Winston? We voted for Brexit before people really knew that the debate was between globalism and nationalism. Mm-hmm. We knew it. Mm-hmm. We got it.
Yeah.
Whether we articulated it clearly or not is academic.
But might that be the last gasp of sovereigntism from the good people of Britain,
and this is
on a the sinking ship.
But this is why it's critical that reform must not drop the ball. Nigel must stay on the battlefield. He must treat his supporters with the respect and the tenderness that they deserve. The movement needs to be nurtured and protected and promoted, and we must all stay true to our promises. There's no room for super egos. We've all got an ego, but there's no room for super egos. Then there's no room for me ahead of us.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be us, and a great deal of that responsibility falls on Nigel Farage's shoulders.
Mm-hmm. Such a wide-spanning conversation as this. To wrap it all up, to bring it together. I mean. Maybe we sort of have, but if there any loose ends you think of what we talked about? We started on Islam in Britain and immigration, and I do think that's all relevant. One question I sort of asked at the beginning that perhaps we can, maybe a positive way to finish is, what is it that unites all Britons? I do ask a lot of guests this question. What is it that unites us all, that we can all come together and get behind, that will make us... I've talked a lot about the British Muslims. What is it that those British Muslims are invited to participate in? What is it that can take us away from sectarianism that we seem to be heading towards?
So what used to unite us all was a belief in what a fantastic country this is. When immigrants came here, when I came here at the age of 13 in 1979, I was in awe of the United Kingdom. I knew of its imperial past. I'd read lots of World War II books and 19th century daring do of, people like Nelson and all the rest of it, and how they went abroad, their pioneering nature, the Industrial Revolution, the Agrarian Revolution, how we stood for what was right and, we stood against what was wrong in Winston Churchill, one of the greatest people that ever lived in history, all of that. That's what brought us together then, and that's what brought immigrants to this country then, because they came here wanting to be part of this fantastic country. What we've sadly done, I think, with this rampant immigration is taking on a lot of people who don't have those views, who are often hostile to our country. And we've allowed the narrative to be set in that we should be ashamed of who we are. And we've got to yank that back. One thing we touched on tangentially, but we didn't articulate, is you said we're a liberal democracy. And our liberalism, which has been the promotion of the individual, has given us the ability, for example, to emancipate women, bring them into the workplace, give them equal rights, both economically as well as constitutionally, etc., etc. Our liberalism has worked in tension with our democracy, which has been for the betterment of the majority. They actually they act in tension, and that if there's a healthy tension between liberalism and democracy, you get a good result. But what I think has happened is that liberalism is on steroids. It's gone mad. Democracy has taken a back seat. And if democracy takes a backseat, so does the nation state, because the nation state, what is the nation state? It is the democratic unit of the United Kingdom. So if you've done away with democracy and liberalism rules all right, that's when the global agenda, the globalist agenda, can infect us, because we're not looking at the democracy, the nation state. So what we need is a yank back towards democracy. And all of us, and liberalism also, by the way, is what gives rise to positive discrimination. It's liberalism that makes the argument that it doesn't matter whether you're an immigrant or a British citizen. It's the liberalism that says, we will respect your culture, we will take the knee to your culture, we will allow you to, we'll celebrate your culture. We need liberalism to just go away for a while and let the democratic voice be heard so we can be settled as a country.
Well, on that note, Ben Habib, an absolute pleasure. I know your time is precious, so thank you so much for coming into the studio to speak with me. I learned so much in that conversation.
Did you? I think of you as knowing just about everything there is to know.
I fascinating, particularly enjoyed understanding Tony Blair as being, it really was all his fault.
Well, I think it was. He is a bastard. Have you read any Salman Rushdie?
Yeah, I've read the Satanic.
Yeah, so you know how characters in his book become, if they're good-natured, they become progressively better-looking physically, and if they're bad-natured, they may start off good-looking in their books, but they become ugly. Have you noticed how ugly Tony Blair has become?
Like a picture of Dorian Gray. Yeah. Well, on that note, Ben Habib,
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Ben Habib. If you enjoyed that, if you want to support the show, all you have to do is press like and subscribe. You press like and subscribe, I can have more wonderful guests like Ben exploring the issues that you at home want to hear about and the mainstream media won't touch. But until next time, be well.